So perhaps we can just go ahead and get started, and in the best interest of time. So we can go first by the order that's listed in the program. So we can start first with. I'm finding the program. Sorry. Michael Strawbridge, are you here? There you go. So by the looks of the program, we have 5 of us presenting. And with that, let's go ahead and have 1, 2, 3. Well, we have 4 of us presenting, sorry. So let's go ahead and have about maybe 12 to 15 minutes each, so that we can have our own individual presentations, and then we can open it up for questions. If any of our participants, as someone is presenting, has a question, feel free to go ahead and put that in the chat, and then we'll take questions at the end of all of the presentations. Okay? All right, let's go ahead. You're still muted, so we can't hear.
There we go.
There you
go. Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Strawbridge, and this is my project, Who Are the Black Sheep? A Descriptive Analysis of Black Republican Men and Women. Despite their small number, Black Republicans aren't a figment of our imagination. They are, however, an understudied population, frequently cast aside, while the primary focus primarily regards Black Americans' minimal partisan differences. But the focus on why most Black people are Democrats is not the same as understanding what it means to be a Black Republican. And a better understanding of Black Republicans is necessary moving forward due to their unusual salience in the American electorate as voters, candidates, and pundits. And this reality, coupled with the Republican Party's calculated reliance on the visibility and intense race relations, make Black Republicans a critical group to study. So the basic question this descriptive analysis looks to ask is, what does being a Black Republican entail? And I answer this question by focusing on 4 key dimensions we refer to in studying Black partisanship. The first is racial group interests. From linked fate, common fate, to racial consciousness, and many other names, the psychological connectedness explanation has been a main fixture in discussing Black political decision-making. But while the role of linked fate or group consciousness is evident in several aspects of Black politics, this is not the case when it comes to partisanship. When Dawson introduced linked fate, he only concluded its indirect role in explaining partisanship, and subsequent research routinely identifies weak or no relationship between linked fate and Black partisan identification. Meanwhile, there is evidence of the historic efforts of Black Republicans fighting for Black interests within the GOP during the 20th century. And even as things changed over the 21st century, sociologist Corey Field suggests we rethink our assumptions about what it means about Black Republicans. In his book, Black Elephants in the Room, he distinguishes the Black Republicans you see pictured here that are political elites versus the everyday Black Republican they interview. And he contests the notion that Black Republicans lack a racial identity or are not concerned with the issues facing the racial group. So there's debate. The second dimension is sociological and regards the influence fellow members of the group have on one another. Steadfast Democrats thoroughly argues democratic partisanship is a well understood norm and Black people police one another to remain politically homogenous. And this perspective underscores the critical role of Black social institutions and networks as transmitters of the dominant political attitudes, orientations, and behaviors. These social institutions include the Black church, Black families, and Black media. And while this perspective suggests Black Republicans are less integrated in these spaces, we can again turn to the work of Corey Field, who suggests not so fast. The third dimension is conservative ideology. And this one's a bit trickier because we know the relationship between Black ideology and Black partisanship is weak at best. But now we're also debating whether Black conservatism is even defined by racial attitudes. And those supposedly conservative attitudes regarding racial inequality, such as the belief that self-help matters more and the greater attribution of blame to individual choices rather than systemic factors, or what I'm interested in with Black Republicans. And it's of interest to me because the Republican Party prides itself on ideological cohesion and the rejection of identity politics, which includes the importance of marginalized identities. The party comes first, and that's a pressure for Black Republicans to live up to. As a Black Republican, it means you must take certain stances to be compliant with the party that doesn't see color and wants to end racial divides in America. This is the party that wants us to forget slavery, forget the civil rights movement, get over racial oppression, and stop drawing on our past to understand our future. My interest is how Black Republicans reckon with that. And lastly, there's a gender component that's due to a couple reasons. The main was the fact that just looking at race to gender alone likely just obscures some nuance in the groups there. And more importantly, there are Black gender gaps within Black men and women's race and gender consciousness, Black public opinion, and their partisan behavior. While 10% of Black voters voted for Donald Trump, 12 to 19% of Black men did versus 6 to 9% of Black women. And Black men and women just historically have different relationships with the Democratic Party. And understanding those different relationships makes it even more important to look at the gender differences in my exploration of Black Republicans. So the three hypotheses in the research question based off those 4 dimensions I outlined are the racial group interest hypothesis. Due to the uncertainty regarding the influence of linked fate and just some evidence of Black Republicans caring about the racial group and racial group interests, I predict that Black Republicans do not feel less connected to the racial group or less concerned with racial group interests. Next, because Republican partisanship departs from the norm that Black networks and social institutions promote, which is Democratic partisanship, I expected Black Republicans to interact with these spaces less. Regarding the conservatism hypothesis, due to the relationship Republicans have with identity politics, I expected that Black Republicans conform to the colorblind politics and have more conservative views regarding racial inequality. And lastly, I explored gender differences throughout. I tested my hypotheses using the 2016 CNPS survey, which is pretty rare, more than 200 Black Republicans, and several questions regarding race, ethnicity, and racialized experiences, which I'll discuss as I go through each section. To assess my racial group interest hypotheses, I examined responses to several questions, including perceived linked fate, how their positive feelings about linked fate, and how important it is for Black Americans to aid various racial subgroups. All the responses for this one were coded in a binary fashion, and the figure depicts the mean score or the proportion of Black Democrats and the difference in the mean score of Black Democrats and Black Republicans who agree with each issue. As you can see, all the differences run contrary to my expectations for Black Republicans feeling similarly connected and concerned with racial group interests. But I should note that of these differences, all of them are significant except for believing it's important to support Black women and support formerly convicted Black people. So it's honestly a matter of how you want to look at it to a certain extent when it comes to racial group interests and concerns. Because in many aspects, the Black Republicans appear to differ from Black Democrats, but they're not totally detached or less concerned with the racial group. Moving to the Black networks and social institutions, the picture is a bit clearer. The first 3 lines regard engagement with different types of Black media, which all support my hypothesis. Meanwhile, the Black interest organization finding was a bit odd, but I partially attribute that due to the prominence of Black Voices for Trump in 2016 being an alternative group you wouldn't expect when you ask someone, are you a member of an organization focused on the interests of Black Americans? And most notably, Black Republicans live in less Black neighborhoods and attend less Black churches. And I did not find any gender differences when looking at the Black network institutions, except for Black Democrats. And finally, regarding conservatism, it's important to note that only 37% of all Black respondents had correctly aligned partisan and ideological identities, which isn't surprising since we understand that Black partisanship and ideology don't mix that way. But that wasn't even the focus here. The focus was on the specific issue of the perspectives regarding racial inequality, where I expected Black Republicans to be more conservative, and this held true. Black Republicans were less likely to view racism as the #1 issue facing their community, and they were even more less likely to view racism as a major issue at all. But there is an important gender gap when looking at perceptions of how important racism is, with Black Republican women much more likely than Black Republican men to believe racism is a major issue in America. Black Republicans were also far more optimistic about racial inequality, either believing that we are near racial inequality or racial equality already exists. Meanwhile, Black Republicans and Black Democrats alike were similarly likely to believe that lack of effort by Black Americans and family instability explain Black-white racial disparities. So the main takeaways are that Black Republicans do not necessarily perceive linked fate with their racial group, but that doesn't mean they're not concerned. They do demonstrate a great deal of concern for certain racial group interests, specifically Black women and formerly incarcerated Black Americans. Black Republicans are significantly less engaged with Black social networks and institutions, and Black Republicans view racial inequalities in vastly different ways than their partisan counterparts. And unlike Black Democrats, where we talk about so many gender gaps and differences between Black men and women, it appears that more often than not, partisanship is overriding race and gender considerations in their behavior, and they're moving as one. So Corey Fields argued for us to reconsider the unidirectional relationship between race and politics for Black Americans, which is that racial group attitudes or racial experiences explain Black attitudes and behaviors, and think about it going both ways. And there's probably some room to think about that, along with, finally settling the debate around psychological versus sociological explanations for partisanship. And I certainly thought about those a lot, and this analysis helps bring some of the discussion to light more. This wasn't a causal model to predict what explains Black partisanship, but just getting us a better understanding of what being a Black Republican simply means. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So next we will have, I don't want to mispronounce it, so I deeply apologize, Diarra Robertson.
It's Diarra, I'm sorry about that.
Diarra, no problem. Mr. Strawbridge, would you mind unsharing? Thank you. And Dr. Robertson, we're ready to receive.
Okay.
Thank you.
Give me 1 second to share my screen. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
My project, or this ongoing research project, is looking at white evangelicalism, conservatism, and presidential politics. This picture was taken from last year's January 6th attempted insurrection, and the picture has obviously a cross with Jesus saves, and this just points to this topic or this interaction between conservatism and evangelicalism. Some scholars suggest, such as Thea Butler, that when we say evangelicalism, it's not even necessary to say white. So this study is kind of looking at this notion of the relationship between evangelicalism, conservatism, and Republicans. And this is a quote from Reverend Dr. Kelly Douglas, Dean of Episcopal Divinity School Union Theological. Linking Anglo-Saxonism with godliness, evangelical Christianity has been historically complicit in promoting a great America that is equated with white supremacy. So this interaction between evangelicalism, conservatism, and white supremacy to a certain degree. This study seeks to examine the relationship between white evangelicalism, conservatism, and electoral politics over the past two presidential elections, 2016 and 2020, excuse me. And I'll primarily be using the ANS data sets from 2016 and 2020. Two primary research questions: how do white evangelicals view race and racism in the United States? Two, Is evangelicalism a greater predictor of Republican voter behavior than party ID? And the hypothesis connected to this is white evangelical Protestants identity mirrors party identification as a predictor of presidential voting behavior. In the past 5 presidential election cycles, the majority of white evangelical voters have voted for the Republican candidate. The closest has been, and technically, even though in 2000, Al Gore had a majority of the Protestant vote, it was a slim majority. But following 2000, you see a significant rise in Protestant support for the Republican Party in general. And these are just the last 2 election cycles from the ANS. As you can see, support for Trump in 2016, 72.2%. In 2020, it was 63.1%. And also, just as a side, even though I didn't focus on Catholics, frequently the numbers descriptively with Catholic voters, white Catholic voters, are close to what Protestant voters or supporters in terms of candidacy. Next, one aspect of this study takes into account how historically white evangelicals conceptualize the world fundamentally different than Black evangelicals. Emerson and Smith, for example, discuss what they characterize as the white evangelical toolkit that encapsulates the ontological lens through which white evangelicals interpret the world. They posit the racially important cultural tools in the white evangelical toolkit are accountable free will, individualism, relationalism, and anti-structuralism. And this is from Emerson and Smith's study in 2000. As it relates to Black people, these constructs actively render a notion of institutional racism invisible and locate any incidence of inequality as a byproduct of personal behavior. Simply stated that they view the world through more of an individualistic interpretation rather than structural interpretation. And this is salient as it relates to Black politics in the sense that frequently scholars track or locate discrimination and racism from an institutional or structural perspective. So at the bare minimum, their interpretive framework is in conflict the way that several Black scholars interpret the world. Although the study does not use the GSS data sets, the ANES data set does contain 4 similar measures. Past slavery, disagree, agree, past slavery makes it more difficult for Blacks. Blacks have gotten less than they deserve. Blacks should work their way up without special favors, and Blacks must try harder to get ahead. The first 2 represent more structural interpretations, while the last 2 represent more individualistic explanations, as the evangelicals do not acknowledge the structural causality, so we should expect white evangelical Protestants to disagree with the first 2 questions. The last 2 questions associate the source of racial inequality with personal behavior, which supports evangelical emphasis on personal responsibility. So with these next few slides, I'm pointing at some of these descriptive statistics of these indicators, focusing on white respondents. So as you can see with the first one, agree, disagree, past slavery and discrimination makes it difficult for Blacks. Amongst Protestants, agree strongly, over 40% of, disagree, I'm starting at the top, disagree strongly, over 35% of Protestants agree with this statement or disagree with this statement in terms of locating slavery or discrimination with, or rather making it more difficult for Blacks today, and disagree somewhat. An additional over 25% or 20%, agree somewhat. And then you see in terms of the 3 major groups that we looked at, it was only Jewish respondents, white Jewish respondents that disagreed strongly or somewhat with this statement in terms of structural sources of discrimination. The next one, Blacks have gotten less than they deserve amongst Protestant respondents, white Protestant respondents, over 30% disagree strongly with that. Over 20, almost 25% disagree somewhat. And you compare this in terms of agreeing, as the previous slide indicated, only among the three major groups, only Jewish respondents agreed with this statement. And these represent more or less the structural indicators. The next two represent these individualistic behavior, agree, disagree. If blacks try harder, they would be as well off as whites. So amongst amongst Protestants, it was a strong response, strongly agree. Over 45% agree with that statement in terms of just, disagree somewhat. I'm sorry, I'm getting these confused. Agree somewhat, it was agree strongly, I'm sorry, it was almost 17% amongst Protestants, agree somewhat, over 25%. And as with the previous ones, the disagree strongly was only amongst Jewish respondents, disagree strongly and disagree somewhat. And that's another indicator of individualistic explanation in terms of inequality. The fourth one, blacks should work their way up without special favors. Among Protestants, agree strongly, over 35%, agree somewhat, over 25%. Disagree strongly. The only one with Jewish respondents with over 30%, and disagree somewhat, over 20%, excuse me, amongst Jewish respondents. So these represented more or less the structural versus individualistic explanations in terms of inequality. And as we see just from a descriptive standpoint, that our initial question in terms of expectation that evangelical Protestants would point more towards individualistic reasons or explanations for discrimination versus structural explanations. Structural versus individual, they they do not embrace structural interpretations for inequality, whereas when you focus more so on the individualistic explanations, they agree strongly or somewhat with these explanations. The next step we tried to look towards was some causal relationships. So we had, I employed two different models, or I looked at a logit model in 2016. I also looked at an OLS model in 2016. And this is trying to getting back to the core hypothesis or argument, whether or not evangelical Protestants served as was a stronger predictor or mirrored party ID as voting outcomes. And as you look at this in 2016, you get almost a 22% increase with the evangelical indicator. Sorry, that's not the 2016, it's the 2016. Yeah, sorry, almost 20%, whereas Republican, you get a little over 8%. And we also, just for, because I do have concerns about interaction effects or additive effects with this, but just for clarity, because this one did indicate a stronger prediction with the Protestant dummy variable, excuse me. I also wanted to look at this as an OLS, so I also did an OLS. And even with the OLS, well, actually with the OLS, you get a stronger prediction, almost 25% with the Republican Party ID versus around 24% with the Protestant ID. So close, the OLS, you see less of a relationship than you with Protestant voters than you do with Republican voters, but you can make an argument that they're in a similar ballpark, which I honestly, initially doing this research, expected that in general that the the traditional, as voting behavior or people that study voting behavior look at all the time, party ID is frequently the more consistent predictor of voting behavior. So this is more in line with traditional studies. The same model was also applied to the 2020 ANS, both the logistic and the OLS. And then with the 2020, we get similar to the 2016 results with the logic model, with the evangelical almost contributing to 70% increase, whereas with the Republican, less than with the a little 30% or almost 40%. And this model was also replicated for OLS as well. So with this one, we see more of a, well, actually with the OLS, with this one, you see more prediction with the evangelical versus Republican, with a little over 33% with evangelical versus a 30% with are you a Republican. So in concluding, our review of the descriptive data verifies that evangelicals do not attribute racial inequality to structural causes. Instead, they attribute inequality to personal decisions. Both logistic and OLS regression models for the 2016 and 2020 election indicate that white evangelical identity mirrors party ID in predicting presidential choice. So in general, the relationships we expected to happen were there for the most part, although I do want to do some further research just to see in terms of if there's any interactions, because of the traditional expectation that party ID will be the stronger predictor, and because you're talking about white respondents who would also be Republican, I do think some further investigation is needed in that regard. So with that, that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Robertson. Dr. Worgs, did I pronounce that properly?
Yeah, that's fine.
No, I want to do it right.
No, that's good enough.
Okay. All right, thank you.
All right. So we need to we're done at 2:45, right? So
Correct.
I'll try to do it in 10 minutes.
Okay.
and okay. Okay, and I'm trying to, this thing is in the way. How do I, give me 1 second. I'm gonna.
It's all the way it's at the bottom where you see the zoom function. Yep. Keep going. I can't see your cursor anymore.
Going, I can't, oh.
It's next to the zoom in and zoom out function of your PowerPoint. Then there is like a projector screen. So go to the bottom of your power. Yeah. Now the other direction. Keep going.
Okay.
Keep going. Nope. You went all the way over too far. Keep going. Keep going. Notes. Yep. Next. One more. And two more. There you go. Nope. You went too far. You went to go over it though. Like the, yeah.
we're just gonna do it like this. I'm
okay. Old, all right.
So
there you go.
I'm gonna do like the old folks who do it wrong, because I actually can't get to this thing. I can't get this out the way. So, all right. So really quickly, the title of our paper is "Moral Frames and Ideological Dualism Among African Americans," and this is really just a what I want to do is just to share with you all some recent information data that we've collected through the CMPS survey. This is kind of the last stage in a much bigger project on morality and African American politics. And so we had one last question that we were asking that I was hoping to, we were hoping to get some insight on. right? So, all right. So our basic focus has been on African Americans' use of moral frames to mobilize people and resources to promote or oppose policies, or to promote widespread civic action aimed at impacting the conditions of African Americans. And so we've been looking at this from a number of different angles. We agree with the scholars who argue that policy, all different kinds of policies can be promoted within a moral frame, or moral frames can be used for varying kinds of policies. There's a whole literature on morality policy that kind of, was fairly narrow in terms of the specific policy areas and policy issues that people focused on. But over time, the literature has expanded, and folks kind of realize, well, yeah, you can use these frames for almost anything, right? Mucciaroni does a great job of kind of presenting a typology of the different four kinds of moral frames that are used. So you've got the private behavior moral frames, those are framing policy issues that's focused on individual behavior. Then you've got what he refers to as social behavior and government behavior moral frames, which focus on things like social behavior, like this, the existence of hungry people, for example, or government behavior, government doing certain things as being immoral, seizing property being immoral or something like that. So there are these different kinds of moral frames that folks use for different policy issues. So what we've been looking at has really been the use amongst African Americans of moral framing and recent developments in that regard. So, for example, in the second decade of the 21st century, we saw in Maryland many African American churches and many African Americans mobilizing around the issue of same-sex marriage to oppose the issue of same-sex marriage. So there's a whole discourse on, morality, politics, et cetera, highlighting, these particular efforts. So that was one example of African Americans using moral frames around what you might call a personal behavior issue in terms of same-sex marriage. But then we also see, moral frames being used for different kinds of issues in a different kind of frame. So we see the Moral Mondays movement led by William Barber that emerges in North Carolina, again, using a moral frame around a progressive political agenda, right? Whether it's voting rights, expansion of healthcare, et cetera, but discussing those issues in the context of morality. This is right, this is morally right or morally wrong. Okay, so here's another example. Voting rights was also kind of presented in that context, right? A moral framing. That's me on the right. Okay, and even the discourses around police reform being presented in this moral framing. It's right or it's wrong. It's unjust, and justice being sort of a moral assessment, if you will. So in order to get some insight into this issue of how African Americans use moral framing, back in 2015, we did a survey of Black faith leaders, just 100 Black faith leaders, and we saw some interesting things, right? And this is still kind of the setup for what the most recent development. So we surveyed these 100 Black faith leaders. They're from 16 different states, number of denominational affiliations. We asked them a variety of questions. So we saw some important dynamics. For example, 88% said same-sex marriage was morally wrong. 84% said abortion was morally wrong. 71% said the death penalty was morally wrong. So on one hand, they're very socially conservative, right? But we also saw that these folks who are very socially conservative, when we asked them, well, a set of issues, do you think these particular issues should be a high priority or a low priority for African Americans? When we put those issues like same-sex marriage and restricting same-sex marriage, or restricting abortion with a list of other issues like, raising the minimum wage, police brutality, addressing police brutality, we found that a much smaller proportion of folks said that banning same-sex marriage or restricting access to abortion should be a high priority relative to, addressing police brutality or raising the minimum wage. So this was interesting and important to us that okay, so these Black faith leaders, while they're against same-sex marriage and they're against abortion, many of them don't think those should be high priority issues, but a majority of them did think it was a high priority issue. So that's important, right? Moving forward, we also asked these folks if they participated in the protest or demonstration against police brutality, against legalized gambling, opposing same-sex marriage, supporting public schools, and supporting voting rights. And we saw that the largest, 44% had protested against police brutality, but also that 15% had protested against same-sex marriage, right? But what was really interesting, I don't think I have the numbers here, is that the folks who protested against same-sex marriage also were very likely to have protested against police brutality, right? And so you have this kind of interesting, what we call duality, and that's kind of a theme of our work so far, is this what we're going to call an ideological dualism, which I'll come back to. So then we wondered, okay, do these faith leaders use moral frames in reference to issues that are not typically debated with using moral frames? What do we mean? Do they use moral frames for other stuff besides, same-sex marriage and abortion? And so we asked a very generic question, what do you think is the most important moral issue or moral issues? What do you think are the most important moral issues impacting America at this moment, right? And so when we asked that question, we found that the largest number said general morality, some kind of like, values are gone, people need to get back to God. But the next largest number was, saying homosexuality, same-sex marriage was the biggest, most important moral issue. But then the third most popular response was racism. And that was interesting to us. And then also we see a lot of people said police brutality and poverty. And so we saw that there were a lot of folks saying what we've considered non-traditional issues as the most important moral issue. And by non-traditional, we mean something other than, personal behavior issues. So we consider the personal behavior stuff to be traditional and things like poverty, racism to be non-traditional. And so then we looked at, we kind of aggregated all these responses, and we found that these faith leaders, 61%, said the most important moral issue was a traditional issue, but 47% said that the most important moral issue was a non-traditional issue like poverty, racism, police brutality. Obviously, the 61 plus 47 is more than 100 because many folks gave more than one answer, right? Okay. Lastly, on this, we also saw that the folks who said the most important moral issue was a non-traditional issue were more likely to have participated in a protest against police brutality, in a protest or demonstration in support of voting rights, or in a protest or demonstration in support of education reform. That was interesting, right? So we then wondered, are these findings reflective of the broader Black population? And so to answer that question, so we did that survey back in 2015. We've been curious about whether or not this reflects the broader population. And so we were able to include some questions in the 2020 CMPS Collaborative Multiracial Post-Election Survey. The survey, of course, some almost 15,000 folks completed interviews online. About 4,000 respondents responded specifically to the questions that we were focused on. So what did we ask and what did we find out? Two questions that I'll touch on today. One was, we asked the respondents, the Black respondents, what do you consider to be the most important moral issues facing the nation? And then we also asked, among other things, please indicate if the following should be a high priority or low priority for the Black community: restricting access to abortions, opposing same-sex marriage. Right. Okay. So interestingly, this surprised us. the responses were almost shocking, in that the responses to this question, some 80% of the respondents said some kind of non-traditional issue, right? And you'll see what it is in a second. Only 19% said a traditional issue like same-sex marriage or LGBT rights or abortion, or some kind of personal behavior thing. The vast majority said what we would consider these non-traditional issues. Okay. And there were some that were unclear that we couldn't put into either category. Very few said abortion or any kind of LGBTQ related issues. Only 5% said abortion. I can explain, but we can break down that 5%, but I don't have much time, so I won't spend much on that. But here's the thing that stuck out to us. Over 50% said racism was the most important moral issue facing America. Racism, discrimination, white supremacy, folks put it in a lot of different ways. So that was striking. But then there were a lot of folks who said things like economic justice, some 11.6%. 10% said inequality, police reform, over 7.6%. Remember, this is out of 4,000 respondents, and which meant that we had to read 4,000 open-ended responses, which of course took quite a bit, and we coded, but I'm not going to complain about that. But it was interesting, right? Next, we looked to see, did folks who said that the most important moral issue was what we call the non-traditional or issue versus a traditional issue, were there some differences between those folks in terms of their behavior? So we specifically looked at whether or not there was differences on the issue of whether or not folks participated in the Black Lives Matter protest or protests for police reform in the last 12 months. And we found that 14.5% of the folks who said a traditional issue had claimed to have participated in a protest, but 19% of the folks who said something non-traditional had participated in a protest. I'm going to wrap up in about 1 more minute. So that was interesting. So the non-traditional folks were more likely to participate in the protest. And then this is a little kind of unclear, but this takes us back to this issue of ideological dualism that I mentioned, right? So we also looked at the folks who said economic justice as the most pressing moral issue, and the folks who said racism is the most pressing moral issue. And we wanted to see if those folks were more or less likely than others to say that, restricting abortion should be a high priority or low priority, or same-sex marriage should be a high priority or low priority. And what we found, and this is pretty interesting to me, that none of this stuff was significant, and there was very little difference between the people who said either of those things. So what does that mean? So if someone said economic justice was the most pressing moral issue, that didn't make them less likely to say that same-sex marriage, restricting same-sex marriage should be a high priority, or didn't make them less likely to say that restricting abortion should be a high priority. Likewise, with racism, it's a little different. With racism, if you said racism was the most pressing moral issue, you weren't really, maybe slightly more likely to say that restricting abortion should not be a high priority, but it's pretty close. Likewise, with racism and restricting same-sex marriage, that was statistically significant in terms of the difference between the people who said it and the people who didn't, but the numbers are still pretty close. What does this mean? This gets us back to this idea of ideological dualism, in which we're arguing that folks who are, that many of these folks are both socially conservative and progressive on issues of race and issues of economic justice. And so it's a dualism. It's not a moderate thing. It's not in the middle. It's you're at the extremes of, you're on both extremes. And when we've seen this in other kind of data that we've looked at, and we saw it again in this data. So to kind of wrap it all up, we think that understanding how folks see these issues through a moral lens helps to explain this dualism that we see in terms of these political attitudes. With that, I will wrap up because we're running out of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I will go ahead and share my screen for mine. So everyone, thank you so much for staying with us. I am Tammy Greer, and this project I am working on is defining the accurate meaning of pro-life. And it is to argue that pro-uterus and pro-birth are not necessarily the same as pro-life. So first, let's understand Roe versus Wade. And in the majority opinion, the Supreme Court wrote in its majority opinion that the embryo or fetus having the capability of meaningful life outside of the womb and or the viability factor outside of the woman's womb is part of the rationale that the Supreme Court used to determine whether or not a woman had the ability to have bodily autonomy and terminate a pregnancy. So first, the lens that I am looking at this work through is looking at traditionalistic and paternalistic cultures. So first, Greenbold and Smith defined traditionalistic political cultures as one that where politics it exists from a social, political, and economic standpoint, and it is held by those who have traditionally had power. And so what does this mean? This means that there is this white heterosexual Christian male perspective of policy, and it is rooted in social conservatism, as well as have that foundation in religion, hence the white heterosexual Christian male. So the paternalistic portion of traditionalistic political culture comes into play because under that white heterosexual Christian male's perspective, all other groups that differ from the white heterosexual Christian male still fall under a paternalistic order, whereas you have the opinions, power from the social, political, and economic power is there from a paternalistic standpoint. And so from a maternal standpoint, there is a lack of or lacks in power as compared to the paternalistic. And then, of course, under this paternalistic, particularly if you're looking through the lens of the white heterosexual Christian male perspective, self-suppression happens within non-white heterosexual Christian male groups, where those that are in power in these non-white groups tend to then self-suppress those that have traditionally been oppressed, even within its own racial and gender group. So from the perspective of looking to justifying the suppression of women and oppression of women, because traditionalism and paternalism has a background in religion, I found some texts from the King James Version of the Bible, where you have these particular Bible texts that help to aid to the rationale as to why there is a suppression of women. Further, I look to, particularly when we're looking at abortion and the restriction of abortion. And of course, what you see on your screen is not indicative of all the states and all the actions that have been taken against women's ability to choose whether or not to continue a pregnancy. These particular states, I chose states that were Southern states as well as non-Southern states for a reason, because we, the universal we, at times have the thought that such restrictions, particularly when we look at it from the lens of traditionalism through religion, that there's a thought that this is only in Southern states, and it is not. Additionally, what is interesting here is that two of the states here, Alabama and Iowa, had white women as the governors at the time to sign those particular actions into law, which goes again back to self-suppression of one's own group. And in that case, it was from gender. There are quite a number of policies here where, again, going back to original, where I am discussing that it is that these particular actions are pro-birth and not necessarily pro-life. When we understand some of these policies as it pertains to women's bodily autonomy, some of these issues here is that, number one, women do lack bodily autonomy, particularly as we look to medical services such as hysterectomy, such as having one's tubes tied, and then when it comes to actual medicine, so when we're looking at the HPV vaccine or birth control, why did I choose HPV? In particular, because that vaccine, when it first came out, was geared toward women, even though men are actually the carrier of the virus. Yet the great state of Texas governor at the time, Rick Perry, attempted to have a mandate for women and girls to take the vaccine and not the actual carrier of the virus, who are the men and boys. From a financial impact, when it comes to determining whether or not these matters are actually pro-life or pro-birth, we see that from a financial standpoint, there tends to be a lack of focus and focus on policy, as well as finances on these particular programs that aid to life. And then I'll touch on foster care in a moment. So here you'll see that from a lack of child support perspective, you see that there are 81, almost 82% of custodial parents at the times are mothers. Yet you see 30% of those mothers that have that are custodial mothers live below the poverty line. There are almost 90% of custodial mothers that are, or parents generally, yet the majority are mothers that are due child support, yet have challenges with receiving. And so then this goes to the point of taking care of the children, which goes to life. Another point to see, and these are the same states that were from the other slide that had to do with the states that enacted abortion restrictions. These are the number of children who are in the foster care system per the state, and then the cost that the state endures as it pertains to children being in the foster care system. Many of these states that have restrictions on abortion have a high number of children that are in foster care system, which aids to the higher cost of managing a foster care system. And most of these states are considered lower tier states in terms of high poverty rate, high unemployment, low education, and other metrics. From a social welfare perspective, again, when we have discussions about pro-life, that means the ability for people to live, then the former presidential administration cut these particular components that have to do with life. And going back to the previous slide about child support, when you have a high number of individuals who have children who live below the poverty line, and then we cut these particular programs that aid those living below the poverty line, then we have to deal with this kind of contradiction between life and ensuring that people actually have the means to provide for oneself. And this takes us all to Kay James, who is the founder of Black Americans for Life, which is an affiliate of the Right to Life, in which Kay James noted that all the fundamental rights that one want to think of, education, healthcare, housing, employment, are important, yet they are not as important as the ability or the right to exist. So it's one of those areas of continued exploration where we have to have a deeper and more profound conversation, a nuanced conversation about what it means to have the right to life versus what it appears to be the mission of the Right to Life and other organizations that are similar, that is more about one being born rather than one having the actual means and ability to actually live. I am doing continued research on this. The paper I have goes much deeper into this particular subject matter. Yet, when it comes to looking at laws, policies, when it comes to looking at the budget for individual spaces, the ability to for people to live does not seem to have the appropriate or proper focus as abortion laws to ensure that a fetus is born. All right. So when it comes, so are there any questions? I know that we're at time, so I'm wondering if there are any questions that anyone has. I did have a question for Dr. Strawbridge real quick, if I could. And I was wondering, when you made a statement about Black conservatives, that they interact less with groups, I'm wondering, Dr. Strawbridge, is it that they interact less or they are invited less to certain events?
Yeah. I ain't no doctor. I'm 30 pieces.
Okay, well, very good. Soon to be. All right. Speaking into
no,
existence.
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to say when I was saying I wasn't trying to make the causal effect there, because like I think it is kind of a chicken and egg thing right now of which comes first. And you could really only get at that with panel data versus something like or experiment. So it's more a matter of your storytelling, how you want to frame it, but both are pretty viable options, I think. That's why I didn't want to assume it's sort of like this is what we're seeing.
Thank you. Okay. Yes, please. Dr. Sanders?
Yeah. First of all, I was kind of in and out because I was trying to get ready for another panel in a second. But I just want to make a couple of really quick comments. I think there's a lot of great papers here, and I'm going to be writing you very soon. Get copies of your papers because all your papers were great. Richard, I'm gonna go ahead and call you Dr. Strawbridge. Go ahead and call you that. You may want to consider looking. I don't know if you made reference to this or not, because I told you I was in and out. But Ishmael White and Cheryl Lairs, and they're working about how social forces shape Black political behavior. And it could be that actually this actually might be an extension of that analysis, because it sounds like from what I was reading correctly, that to the extent that social networks influence Black political behavior with Democrats, it could be that the reverse is happening with Republicans, is that a lot of Black Republicans are not connected to those networks, sometimes by choice, and so they tend to maybe be more individualistic in their thinking. So I think there's a lot. I think those things kind of go together. I think Diarra and Donn, your papers kind of come together. Come together in a lot of ways, because white evangelicalism is definitely positively, strongly correlated with conservative politics. You can go all the way back to the Protestant work ethic, and this idea of of individual responsibility, creates an ideological roadblock into them. In fact, there probably is some data that and you may want to look at this and look at this that suggests that white evangelicals are even more likely than other Americans to think in individualistic terms, because it's oftentimes it's rationalized by religion. So that makes them view it that way. And I was thinking about Donn, in your paper, I was thinking about the idea that when you're talking about talking about this ideological dualism, I don't know if it's much of dualism is Black people always have a much more broader definition of what it means to be moral. And to the extent that so-called traditional morality, that dovetails with this whole white evangelical, this individualism, kind of this idea that moralism is defined by individual behavior. And so it fits in this idea, when you're talking about abortion, when you're talking about LGBT clients, you're talking about individuals, in their mind, individuals who are acting morally. But the social stuff we're gonna leave alone. And Black people typically have Black people see it as a false choice, which is why conservative Republicans who try to make moral appeals have limited ability to get mass Black folks to go along with that, because Black people don't think about morality in the ways that white folks do. And I like your paper a lot too, Tammy, but I got a panel of my own I gotta get to, so I don't want you to be interpreted as I talked about theirs and not about yours, because yours is good too. But so I'll be writing you too.
Okay. So if no one else has anything, we deeply appreciate you all coming to our panel and listening to our papers. And of course, reach out to any and all of us if you have any questions, concerns, comments, or feedback. All right. We appreciate you very much. Thank you so much. And
Thank you for being the chair.
Of course.
Thank you.
Enjoy NCOBPS. Thank you.